everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Diana.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Alan.
Wait a minute, Alan. Alan, you're not always here. Wait a minute. I seem to have stumbled into a book club episode of our podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. But how could that be? Because it's also a regular episode of the show. What kind of crazy amalgamation have we created here? My goodness. Well, for listeners here, because I didn't know which order we were doing these bits, you'll also get a second introduction very soon. But we had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Linda LeBlanc and Dr. Amanda Karsten about their new book, Ethics, Proactive and Practical Decision-Making for Behavior Analysts. And since it's a book, and since it's the summer of book clubs, we said, you know what, let's do both. Let's make it an episode where we talk about the book like we would research articles, which we do every other week. And you know what? Let's get Alan on to make it a little book club as well. So it's going to be both things this episode. So we're going to start off with a little discussion of the book itself. Then we'll cut to me doing the introduction again for the main episode. Or we'll edit that out and it will just seamlessly go into the conversation. But I don't think we can do it because that's not how I segue very well. In any case, so here we all are. Jackie, unfortunately, could not be here for this part, but you'll see her in the second half.
Unfortunately, because she's in Hawaii.
She's in Hawaii. I know.
So don't feel too bad for Jackie.
Yes, don't cry for her. She's already in Hawaii. Oh, boy. So we have a copy of the book from the authors. It only recently came out. And so we'll do kind of a brief version of our normal book club. We were not going to go through it in depth like we normally do on these book club episodes. If you want to hear us go on at length, listen to last month's and next month's book club episodes. Because again, summer book clubs. But why don't we start, Alan? Why don't we start with you? What were your general thoughts on reading this book, this tome?
I found it like very nice, very helpful to have like a new book on this. As someone who supervises both RBTs and behavior analytic trainees, this was very nice from that mindset of there's a lot of practical, up-to-date stuff in here. I like they reference a very broad range. I think you see that even in like the section 1, like they have references to like really meaningful things like project impact. They talk about like working with people who are BIPOC. They talk about like all within like just a couple pages because they're trying to like set the sort of scope of what they're trying to talk about. So I really appreciate that they really bring in and talk about new like assessment tools and new frameworks to think about. So no, I really enjoyed it, and I like all of the little like visuals and sidebars and things like that. So it's a very well organized book for an important topic in our field.
Yeah. And Diana, I know you were in the main kind of interview section of the show, but we didn't really talk too much about
Previously, I was in the future.
Previously on,
yeah.
And in the future, you will be in the recording. It's podcast magic, folks. We didn't talk as much about kind of our general thoughts on the book. We said some positive things, but then we kind of got into the questions, the writing of the book and all that. So what were kind of your general take homes or your overall thoughts as reading the book?
Writing a book about the BACB ethics code seems to me like a topic that one could pretty easily slip over into the realm of turgidity. However, I did not find that to be the case here. Like Alan said, they do a really masterful job of weaving throughout this book current references, highly relevant references to a range of literature in our field, and heavily include current topics that should not be shied away from, and they in no way shy away from them here. So there are many, it reads like a quick summary of like what's important to know in our field as far as current cultural responsiveness research, for example, right? And then you get an entire summary of that. So throughout the book, they bring in those types of more complex issues and ways in which we should be thinking about ethics. So it's in no way just like, let me give you a list of the ethics code and talk about each one, because that would be quite dry. Instead, it brings the code to life and does so via these types of important discussions, as well as case scenarios, lists that you can reference, etc. So it's really nicely put together. How about you, Rob?
So I think this might be the first ethics book since the updated code, meaning the authors were able to focus on the core principles in a way that I haven't seen in any other writing on ethics, which again usually does focus a little bit more on the, this part of the code means that. I think Darren Shush and Adele Nadowski's book.
I like that book too.
That update, I think, did have the core principles in there. And actually, even the first edition of that book did sort of focus a little bit more on big picture concepts. But I think having the core principles and being able to focus on the core principles made this book more readable than I think some ethics books I've read. Certainly if you were sort of newer to ethics or discussing ethics, because when we get into the sort of code header dot subheader of the code, I think it gets hard to follow all of the rules, and it feels like I'm just reading rules I have to do. Like I have to do the board game rules in order so that I'm playing the toughest game ever. And when you're focused on
game, ethics,
and when you're focused on concepts, you can spend more of your time thinking about why you are following any of those rules or why those rules are relevant. So even if you can't memorize all of them, like say Jackie can, she's not here to show you how she can do it, but she can do that. You still are getting at the crux of what each code means in terms of how you practice and how you reflect on your practice, which was a lot more, certainly more readable than certain ethics books I've read. I've read some really good ones too, but it felt like that focus of practical and proactive actions was much more sort of doable right from the get-go than other books where I've had to sort of sit back, think about them, read them again, talk about them with other people, and then reflect on how it fits in my practice. So I the longer I do this job, I think the harder it is for me to remember what was it like when I first started doing this. So I sort of play the part of, I'm going to pretend this is what I was like. And I think if this were, say, the first ethics book I'd ever read, I would have understood ethics in a more complete fashion a lot sooner. I think, again, I'm playing the part of Rob in his mid-20s, which is an ancient time at this point.
They had books back then?
It would have been a vellum scroll, I think, Alan. We would have unfurled it from the Phoenicians and gotten a copy there.
Just want to say, Rob is not kidding about Jackie knowing the code, and because we've done live trivia in several different variations at this point, and we come up with all of the categories basically from scratch. So one time, Jackie came up with a category called Know the Code, and she would give you like a piece of the ethics code, and you had to write down. It was the old edition of the code, but so you had to write down like the number dot. And she was very confident that everyone would know these, but no one knew the code.
It was a poorly received game.
It was just really hard. I mean, I don't have the code memorized.
Between that and our CMO game, I think those are not preferred. I think people like the ones where
not preferred.
I think people like the ones where we compare, is B.S. Skinner older or younger than sliced bread? That one I think is always a winner.
All right. So what do we need? What do we need to make sure people know?
So we don't talk a lot about the structure. I think we do talk about the content a bit, but I think it's good to go over sort of the structure of the book, because I know y'all out there are very busy. One of the things that sometimes is nice, I think, about having these book clubs is it's like the it's like the edited Audible version of the book that you might not have time to read, that we just plus our footnotes.
But you should go read it.
I'm not saying you shouldn't read this book. However, if you are under a time crunch and you say, I read all the ethics books, what could I read here that is the most actionable? Personally, for me, if you had read all the ethics books and were really up on sort of, more, they're not new themes, but I think they're sort of making a resurgence in the literature on things like community-based participation in our research. Or if you'd either listened to or read work by Malika Pritchett on sort of some of the history of, ethics in research, then you could probably jump to part 3 of the book, which does focus on actions you can take day to day to make sure you are doing your best to live by ethics. And I think Dr. Karsten will talk about this at more length in the kind of the main body of the episode. But a lot of that comes down to, how do you have systems that allow you to make time for being, for practicing ethics rather than just running from task to task. So that would be the part 3, facilitating ethical action in everyday practice. So if you're like, I refuse to read multiple parts of a book, I'll only read one. That's a weird, rigid rule I have. Part 3 might be where I would say to start.
We could also tell them that there are 3 parts.
Yeah, that's the one I just said to read, though. You could read them all.
Okay, so part 1 is called Foundations for a Proactive and Practical Approach to Ethics. Part 2 is the actual ethics code, where they go through each section, all 6 sections. So that one's called the BACB Ethics Code for Behavior Analysts. And part 3 is facilitating ethical action in everyday practice. So those are the 3 parts. And you're saying you found part 3 to have the most application.
I think direct application. Yes.
Yeah.
And again, only if in the context of you don't have enough time to read this whole book. It's a very thorough book, but that one, if you have a good foundation of ethics, I think that one had the most information that was actionable quickly. And I hadn't seen all of the, not that I'd seen everything in the book already, but I think had the most information that kind of like coalesced everything that had been in the book already. So if you have a background in ethics, you could use those strategies really right away.
I had just an extra note I wanted to add that's beyond the structure, that I think as a newer behavior analyst in the grand scheme of things, because I'm still within the first 5 years of like actually being licensed. I found that in the ethics discussion, we sort of all agree ethics are good. And then there's a really loud and reasonable narrative that's sort of what I think of as the pro-neutrality of like, it's very important. The ethical thing is that we remain as neutral as possible because we want to make sure that we can be available to all people. But there is some opposition to that, what I would say as a more pro-involvement of like, it's very important that we proactively, that ethics should be proactive, not reactive, and that we should take stances, that inclusivity is something that we should always be growing the umbrella, not waiting for people to join us. Mm-hmm. That whether it's what makes an evidence-based practice ethical for us to use versus who should be part of the conversation, we should always be seeking to expand and grow and learn. I think that this book is the first book I've read that really captures well that pro-involvement side of the conversation that I feel you often have with like your professors or with like really engaged like directors of clinical service and things like that, but there just hasn't been as much literature about it. So that's what I really appreciated about this book is it's like, no, this is like ethics is a series of actions that you're always doing and reviewing, and it involves a lot of like self-management, but also like taking uncomfortable stances sometimes because we should be like if those people need our help, we should be advocating for them. So I really did appreciate that about this book as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go.
I think some of the initial sections, in part one, I appreciated the contextual view of ethics as well. The sense that we are not ethical based on our knowledge of the code or lack of knowledge of the code, though certainly lack of knowledge of the code makes it easier to act unethically. But we are unethical, or we act unethically, I should say, due to various contexts. And sometimes that includes making actions that themselves would be considered unethical by the code, or by responding poorly to actions that are unethical by the code in such a way that it minimizes the chance that in the future, the people that work with us will improve their ethical action, because we've created environments in which the punishment for unethical action is so high that it is probably easier to just keep it all under the radar, that we're not getting enough reinforcement for ethical behavior, that we don't have the systems in place to maintain ethical performance, that the requirements of our job actually reward unethical behavior and do not, and at best are neutral to our ethical behavior. And I think when you look at ethics from that contextual viewpoint, the circumstances view that Pat Fryman talks about, and then they talk about a lot about in this book, it does make ethics more of a series of meaningful problems with solutions that, if we take the time to think about them, become easier and easier to resolve, rather than a series of errors that we are hoping never happen to us, and we will make sure to shun anyone else. It's sort of the weirdly Puritan viewpoint of the world. And I don't know about y'all, but even though I live in Massachusetts, I do not want to go about ethical conundrums like it's the Scarlet Letter in terms of our responses to things. It's not my jam.
Well, and I think it also, this book displays the sort of model of ethical compliance in a way that we sort of talk about feedback, giving and receiving feedback importantly, but like why it's very important is the BACB makes it clear they only want to be made aware of the grossest and most intense ethical violations. Everything else should be us policing ourselves as professionals, which means receiving feedback when we've acted unethically, maybe accidentally, and also giving feedback freely when we see something that we worry is unethical. And allowing the person who's getting that feedback to correct it in a way that is like meaningful and addresses all the contingencies that they are trying to manage. And so it's very important that we not be like coercive or like threat. Like it's very important that we give people the benefit of the doubt, but we also give them the feedback to act on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think people really struggle with that in most settings, that like, oh, like I'm getting corrective feedback, it means I've done something wrong. No, this isn't the world of if it's not an A+, it's a failure. It's a, no, we understand you've got a lot of, there are many competing contingencies. We've slipped up and we need to correct it, and we need to correct it right now and make sure this doesn't happen again. And that's fine, you know. Because even just as I've been talking to trainees about like taking the exam, I was like, the problem with the exam is that there's multiple right answers for the way we might implement a program or how we might do something. You have to be very careful about reading what kind of answer they want in the question. It's not saying the other questions are wrong. It's just not the most appropriate answer for what the exam is asking about. But that doesn't mean that the ones you thought were right are completely invalid. They may have been better for other considerations. We just don't do a great job. And that, like, ethics is like that too. Some like risk benefit analysis shows you that there's like, well, the risks are high, but the benefits are high, and we are willing to move ahead on this because we're all aware of what's going on. And I think this book lays that out kind of pretty nicely about how that process should work so that you can engage in that.
Mm-hmm. Kind of speaking of ethical situations, what did you think of the scenarios? Because I found them to be really scary. Like they were very real. I don't think I've read a lot of ethical scenarios, and usually they're for teaching purposes. So there's sort of a like kind of like the BACB exam in terms of like, here's the key information you need to, because you're new to this. You need to, what are you focusing on? How are you going through your systems? How are you addressing these situations? Whereas these felt very lived in and very uncomfortable to read, because they seem like the sort of thing like I could wake up and do this tomorrow. Like some of these, like they're so anyone could be in this situation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I like that, like some of their examples, they talk about like HIPAA openly. I don't know that I've ever actually been in an ethics situation that wasn't a HIPAA specific class that brought up a HIPAA violation within our ethics, which of course it should. Like, that makes sense. But the way that they talk about it and the extent of it makes a lot of sense. And it's very like about correcting and preventing the problem, not turn this person over, they're being horrible necessarily. Like, it's very much there are nuances to this, and we should be supportive of this, and we should allow the person who has made the ethics violation correct the behavior, because our field is probably better with them in it than without it if they are willing to correct that behavior, which is part of that like proactive mindset of let's be inclusive and proactive at the same time, because we don't know why someone could have acted unethically out of ignorance or misunderstanding or bad modeling. So, no, I like the scenarios, and I also like the appendices, the like self-assessments for both the BCBA and the RBTs. I'm definitely going to be bringing that to my supervisor so that we can implement it with our RBTs to some extent, because I think it's very useful and very nice, and I'd not seen anything quite like that.
I agree. So this is definitely a book when I'm done, I'm like, I want to Xerox all the tables, and where will I put these tables so we all have to use them at my place of work, so we're all following these systems. Like I love a good system, and maybe you'd go overboard if you immediately were like, I have to implement all the tables and self-reflections. Like, the book's great about making sure you carve out time for yourself and for ethical thinking, but maybe doing all the tables, you don't need it all. Maybe it's like, over the span of a year, you could touch on each one a little bit or spend some time on self-reflection. But I do love having something I can check off and do my thought process of, have I been following these principles, or how haven't I been following these principles? And then what are the action steps I will now take to, ameliorate the potential for this problem?
Yeah. And I think that, again, they do a good job of, like, the kind of thinking I see in this book is the kind of thinking I challenge my trainees to do, is to, like, look with our clients, like our clients engaging in challenging behavior. Well, let's look at what's going on from their point of view so that we teach them the skill that's meaningful to them, not the skill that's most convenient to us. Let's, talk about, like, self-interrupting and getting some self-management, not tolerance and delay and all these traditional terms, which still have their place. But for clients that, like, it's appropriate to have the conversation, let's identify that from the start and work our way back, not be like, well, we'll get there eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely, the layout, I'm sort of kind of scanning through and, going over anything that we want to make sure we touch on. But I did like the thematic view of ethics. It definitely made each of the components of the code that much more straightforward. It's not quite the right word, because each of those themes could contain like multiple codes, multiple layers, multiple contexts that you need to be aware of. But there was just something about reading about ethical themes, similar to when you're talking kind of as the core principles as part of your problem solving with ethics, that it feels more, there's something about it that I'm sort of able to make my like ethics thought process TA click a bit better when I'm looking at those kind of bigger picture themes than when I'm trying to identify, well, which of these codes do I need to be paying attention to? Because while one needs to have those in terms of being able to follow up on ethical violations. If all you focus on are the rules, I think it does sort of inadvertently teach you that your goal is to not do these things, or your goal is to do these things, but not think about why or how. And then we do get in a position of you didn't do this or you did do this, which is not sustainable behavior change. It's anyone could follow any of these ethical, any of the ethical codes, once or twice. But why are you following them all the time? How are you following them all the time? How would you know you weren't following them until someone said, by the way, I noticed you didn't do 5.1 or, whatever the violation is. It lent itself, I think, to certainly reading. It was a lot easier to read as a book, because I tend to read every book like I'm reading a paperback on an airplane to some extent. Like I don't necessarily discriminate that this is a science book and I read it this way. I read everything like there's a story that they're telling me and I need to be able to follow it.
Yeah. I really like in section 3 where they're talking about advancing your skills in the third part, where I don't think I really had, outside of a more classical textbook, ethics and research talked in a practical handbook, where they're talking about application in consultancy and education. And I feel like we see that. I've seen that in the ethics books, but they also like, no, there's this other part of the field where ethics is extra important. And the same principles apply. And it's not like a whole nother book. It's just another chapter within the book that has its place, talks about very serious things, and moves on. And it's, in a way, a nice overview should.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I think unlike most of our book clubs, we're not going to do a deep dive section by section. We just had some nice chance to do some broader thoughts on the book. So I'm gonna pass it over to our other recording, where we'll be talking with Dr. LeBlanc and Dr. Karsten about the book and asking more questions, getting a little bit more in depth into the process and some of the steps that we've talked about a little bit here. But before we get into that second section, it's going to be kind of early on. I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening, you can earn two. There's a book club. There's 2 ethics CEs. All you need to do is finish listening, and you've only scratched the surface of our book club right now. Listen to the whole episode and put in 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now, and then you'll have the next one later on in the episode. The first one is Gus, G-U-S. And who's Gus, you might say? Is it an ethical character in the book? Do they make some faux pas in one of the scenarios? No. Gus is the name of Dr. Karsten's brand new puppy. So when this recording comes out, it will not be as brand new a puppy, but as of our recording, it was a puppy of the day. Listen closely. You may hear a few dog noises in the background. I think I remember one. It was very cute, but everyone had a dog except for me and Diana at our recording. Right now, Alan, you don't have a dog hiding behind you, do you?
No.
Okay.
I do not.
So no dogs. No dogs for us. All right. And with that code word out of the way, let's head into the rest of the recording, which I'll do by reintroducing the podcast. And here it is.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey, everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Oh, hey there, Rob. It's me.
Well, I didn't see you there, Jackie. Well,
I just popped out of your bookshelf like Narnia.
I think it was a wardrobe. I guess it depends on the Narnia.
And it's me, Diana. Hi.
Diana, you sound like
along.
you're very far away. Where are you? Where could you be?
Oh, Rob and I are not in the same location today. I'm recording from the field, which is my bedroom, because I'm sick.
Yes.
You know what? We're making it work.
Oof. All right. Well, we picked a great time to be remote because we
I
said
appreciate that.
we need as many Zoom windows as we possibly can get. So we are very fortunate today to be joined by two special guests. We're going to be talking all about a new book called Ethics. And then there's a whole subtitle, but ethics is the big word, the ethics book. It is. And we have two special guests joining us. Who is joining us today to make this the most online episode we've ever had?
Hi, everybody. This is Amanda Karsten. So glad to be with you.
And I'm Linda LeBlanc, coming to you from Golden, Colorado.
Oh boy! Well, we have so many illustrious names joining us today. Linda, we were talking. This is your first main full episode with us. We're very excited to have you here.
Excited to be here.
And Amanda, this is a returning episode. It's been a long time, but we're glad to have you back on the show.
Oh, it's so good to be back.
Tidbit, Amanda, every time a listener comes over and talks to me about your episodes still, because people listen to the backlogs of episodes, they're like, the squirrel, right? The squirrel, the data squirrel.
Data squirrel.
Yeah, the data squirrel.
Your podcast is basically the last lingering reason that my kids think I'm pretty cool.
Oh, nice. So, well, yeah, it's time to re-up then, right?
Yes.
The episode we're talking about, everyone, is episode 17 of the show.
Oh, my goodness.
A long time ago.
Way back in the day. So, yes, we're past due to have you back, and we're so excited to have you both.
So we were very lucky to have Amanda and Linda reach out and say, we'd love to talk about a new book coming out. And we're always excited to talk about ethics. I know listeners are always excited to hear about ethics. Jackie's waving. You cannot see this if you're listening to the feed. But Linda and Amanda put together a really great ethics. I don't know if it's a spoiler if I say it was really great, and I enjoyed reading it. Right at the top, should I save that to the end? But a really great book about ethics. Diana, what is you have the copy of the book that we have? So what is the full title?
Sure, it's titled Ethics: Proactive and Practical Decision Making for Behavior Analysts by Dr. Linda LeBlanc and Dr. Amanda Karsten, published by Sloan Publishing. 2023.
2024. This is hot off the presses.
Hot
ethics off the presses.
I want to tell the listeners what the cover looks like because it was very amusing. So the cover has some trees and it's a forest. It's almost fall. It's not quite fall, right? Because there's hints of fall there. And then there's two paths.
A greenish yellow wood, I would say.
And there's a brown path and it forks. And my husband walked into the room that I do my work in, and he goes, "Oh, look, it's like Robert Frost." And I was like, ha ha ha, joke. And then my kid walked into the room, she's like, "One of those paths is haunted." So everyone had something to say about the book as it was just laying on the table. So
So
spoiler
one of those
alert,
that may not be off traveled, and let's hope not, because it's haunted.
Be haunted by the ghost of ethical conundrums past if you take the wrong path.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. That's fitting.
Yes,
So, Amanda and Linda, we'd love to hear, for folks who for some reason they have not read any, this is maybe they just started graduate school and they have never heard of you both before. Would you mind doing kind of a quick summary of yourselves and then, how you became interested in writing an entire book about ethics?
Sure. I'll start this one. So I'm Linda LeBlanc, and I've been a behavior analyst for about 30 years now. I'm also a licensed psychologist. And so I had a different ethics code, and I still have that ethics code because I'm still licensed, before there was a BACB ethics code. So I operate under two. I was a professor for a long time. And in fact, Amanda and I met when I was on the faculty at Western Michigan University, and she was a graduate student in that program. After being a professor for about 15 years, I became the executive director of a large human service organization and spent a lot of time building ethics resources for the team that I was supporting. And then about 6 years ago, I guess 7 years ago now, I started my own consulting company, and I work with a variety of different organizations on lots of things, but also one of those things is building systems to support ethical behavior.
Yes, and as Linda mentioned, we got to meet at Western Michigan University, where I completed my doctoral studies, and then was able to go on to Western New England University and have the lucky draw of teaching ethics. So I really came to this work and a passion in this area just through teaching and being with lots of students, and then eventually lots of supervisees at various stages of their careers, and just seeing all of the complexity that folks are dealing with on a regular basis, and really made me want to try and create a resource that can help.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So when it comes to writing an ethics book, I got to imagine part one is saying, there's already kind of a lot of books about ethics out there. Do we need another ethics book? Like, what are we going to add? Are we going to go into more detail, better scenarios? What was sort of the process of deciding, A, we're going to write an ethics book, and then B, how do we make an ethics book that isn't just one more ethics book that's like, yeah, I know the code, I read it, it's a little pamphlet, it's just getting reiterated over and over, like how to add your spin to it.
Just want to say quickly, Rob, that's kind of like the question, do I really need another pair of shoes?
Oh, okay.
Right, and yes, you do. When you started writing this book, there really was only one primary ethics book in behavior analysis. And so the others that exist now kind of came out on the very long journey of us writing this book. So I had finished a supervision textbook with my co-authors, Dr. Tyra Sellers and Dr. Shala Alai, and that was also published with Sloan Publishing. And my publisher there, Bill Weber, had indicated if I was ever interested in writing another book to reach out to him. And I began thinking about, if I were to write another one, I think it would be in the area of ethics. And I felt like most people approach ethics as focusing on what you should do when there's a terrible screw up, rather than as the little everyday behaviors that you do that create the fabric of appropriate professional behavior. And so I wanted to try to write a book that would be about all of the little things that you could do every day to make yourself, responsibility to self first, rather than having this outward vigilant who's screwing up focus. And so I was, talking about that at dinner one night with my family and some guests, and mentioned that I kind of wanted to do this. And folks said, well, you should. And I was like, well, I'm not going to write a book alone. That sounds miserable and lonely. And Jim mentioned, what about Amanda? I know she's been teaching ethics. She's a fantastic writer. You should just call her and see what she thinks. So I did. And she thought, yes.
Was it that easy, Amanda? Was that quick? You were like, of course, ethics book. That's
yeah. I was like, tell me more. How many years does your average book take? No, I was really delighted by the opportunity and One other piece that I really hope that this textbook adds, that is somewhat novel for our field, is a product of the fact that we have our recently updated code, which includes these foundational principles. And I think those are such an essential piece to center when it comes to how rapidly the field and just society, our context in general, is shifting, that we need some solid ground to turn back to when we can't find the standard that tells us exactly what to do or exactly where that boundary of our responsibilities is or the priorities need to be set. And so the opportunity to be proactive, the opportunity to weave in foundational principles, as part of the ongoing evolution of ethics in our profession, those are some of the things that really excited me about this project.
Were you ever scared that as soon as your book got published, a new revised ethics code would come out? Because that is always my fear. Just when I created something beautiful, it's like, look, task list 100, ethics code again.
Maybe it was a little bit nerve-wracking in that way, but again, with the foundational principles, it really was an advantage in writing something that I think will be evergreen, even as we inevitably continue to evolve.
Yeah, and I think we very intentionally kind of bookended the current structure of the code with chapters that should be useful no matter how that code changes. So that's not to say that a second edition won't have edited section 1 and section 3, but if the code were to change, it's section 2 that I think primarily would shift a bit.
Mm-hmm. I would say, I think one of the things I really enjoyed about your book was how much it did focus on those core principles. Like there was a real sense of, here are generally, here are the numbers. It's like 5.10, 4.4. But the focus was just so much more on those 4 core principles. And here's how it would look in terms of the code. I don't know if it was, I'm guessing it was not purposely in case you had to do a second edition. You could just quickly change the numbers on there and boom, you're all done. But it really left me thinking about the themes of each of the sections of the code rather than a lot of ethics books where I feel like I'm being forced to memorize all of these very complicated like number, code, subcode, and I just lose track. And I feel like I'm reading, the rules of like a board game and it's like too complicated. I'm like, I don't want to play this game. It's like too hard. No one's going to understand it. Like it just felt very accessible in that regard because it was so focused on the concepts and what that looked like you were saying, Linda, the day-to-day, rather than here are the ethical screw-ups, don't do this, don't get in this problem, and if you do, get a new job. It was very, very active engagement, which I really enjoyed.
Right. We definitely wanted to focus on the core values and those things as you can remember 4 things. You may not be able to remember 117 things, but you can remember 4 things, particularly when they're meaningful and anchored to emotional experiences on an everyday basis. And so even when I started creating ethics resources at Trumpet, my goal was always, don't worry quite so much about the code number. You can look that up. Things don't show up in your daily basis with a sign that says, hello, today's event is related to item 4.17. It just happens and you experience it a certain way and you feel it a certain way. And that experience, if you can contextualize whatever it is you're seeing and experiencing in terms of, and I actually had come up with slightly different values because they were just the ones for my company. But what I would always tell people is if you can tie it back to integrity, appropriate boundaries, always putting that client first, etc., then you're going to be more likely to recognize that there's something here to respond to. And then you can seek help and we'll figure out the number. So in this instance, we really wanted to get people focused on whatever the number is. That number's in there for a reason, and the reason is related to these 4 core values. So look for how the situation seems to bump up against or mesh well with those values.
Ooh. Now, I have another kind of, I think this might be our last question sort of on the general like creation of the book or the writing of the book. One thing that I was really, it's so amazing was it felt like the amount of preparation and, art. I mean, I don't know how many of the articles, some of them I know like Linda or Amanda, you've already written, so they probably were kind of familiar, but it felt like your book took years and years and years and years and some very recent research on areas related to subjects from certainly history of behavior analysis, history of research practices, all the way up to some of the work on sort of like, community participation in research, cultural humility, like very modern, publications, and wrapped it all around the themes and the principles of ethics very well in a way that almost felt like this book was, citing everything that had ever come out in this very interesting way and tying it all into our ethical code and our practice code. That can't have been an easy thing to do. I mean, that reference list feels like we read all the papers ever and we made a book using the code as well. How did you go about like what fits? What do we not need? What do we want to make sure is in here? That just seems so overwhelming.
Yeah.
It was, yes.
That's where you're supposed to lie and say, super easy. We just did it one day.
Thank you for saying, encouraging things about the way that our reference list and the incorporation of scholarship landed for you. That was definitely one of the guiding values that we had going into this process, is wanting to be current and comprehensive, but knowing that the topic of ethics is so broad and so deep that we would have to limit ourselves so that people would actually be willing to pick this book up and use it, which is less likely to happen if it's, 500 pages. So there was a lot of editing and a lot of conversations along the way just to try and get down to what is essential, but also we felt like, did some justice to the big topics that we were wrestling with. But it definitely was a lot of reading and a lot of conversation just to get to the point that we could start putting words to the page. And I'm grateful for that, for all those resources.
Yes. And at the same time, writing a book, but, not even a book chapter, but a book is really different than a lot of the other writing that I've done, which actually has a more dense citation rate in it. And so I kind of constantly felt like we're not citing enough. I'm like writing these sentences and there's no citation, and I get it. I'm the one who's saying it, and someday someone will cite the book, but need more citations. So we kind of had to talk each other back from, we might not need 70 per chapter, as if we were writing a handbook, which really is designed to be the most comprehensive analysis of a certain literature. But cool things kept coming out. Mm-hmm. And so we generally had a notion of what kinds of things we wanted to rely on for each chapter. And then new things would come out. And we ended up kind of revisiting almost every chapter as new things got published, which meant the book took, maybe a third longer than we thought it would.
I can say that I actually really appreciated the historical context chapters, where you lay in all of the malpractice, one might say, right? All the unethical behavior. I don't think it's ever been laid out in that way in a book. So like as a professor of ethics, because I teach it as well, like having to pull all of those things, right? And we talk about them at different times, but having one chapter is like really helpful, I think, for the student, because it's a nice timeline before you like get into the ethical standards themselves. Like, here's why we have to have this, everyone. And I thought that was really, really nice.
Well, and that's kudos primarily to Amanda. Each of us was the initial architect of certain chapters, and then the other one chimed in, and that historical foundations chapter was one that Amanda took the lead on. And, we began by kind of talking through, we have to talk about this episode and we have to kind of talk about this and we need to include something on this. But Amanda was the one who did a lot of deep reading and extensive writing. And to be honest with you, that's a heavy chapter. It really is focused on the things that have not, gone well for humanity, whether we recognized it at the time or only in hindsight. That said, we have to explore the lessons that are learnable for the past, or all of that harm will have occurred for no benefit. So she did the great thing there.
Oh, that's very kind, Linda. And I'm glad that the chapter seems like it will be useful. It was very heavy to research, very heavy to put together, and it should be. Those are the stakes that we work with in human services.
So, Amanda, when you were writing that chapter, were there any of the sort of exemplars from sort of the historical timeline that, kind of most got under your skin and you felt you kind of held with you as you were writing sort of later sections in the book, or that kind of informed some of the other, the way you were phrasing or the way you were thinking about the ethics code, possibly in a way you hadn't before?
Boy, that's a great question. All of the examples are in there because, again, we went through this process of trying to curate and say, we could go into depth and detail on a lot of the history of human rights violations and what pieces kind of add something to this synthesis, this representation. I'll honestly say that the Wakefield case is one that found I was reflecting on a lot later in the writing process because, Andrew Wakefield's fabrication of data had such spiraling impacts on the science, on society, on parents and families. And so you just never know. You don't know at the time that an ethical scenario is taking place the worst possible impact and spread of those effects that are possible. So I did find myself really humbled by that example. And to this day, I think back on it as I am teaching my current students.
Mm-hmm. Linda, did any events from that chapter that kind of had a similar impact or a different impact on you so that kind of as you were writing the rest of the book or reviewing it?
Well, they're all upsetting, right? It's hindsight. We not only experience those events as what happened, but the subsequent effects that have occurred as a result of them. And for me, I think what was humbling was to try to take that lesson from chapter 3 that each of these people that did things that we now view as how could anyone have done, they didn't wake up identifying as a horrible human being who's out to harm the world. They were simply behaving in their circumstances without the appropriate perspective and thoughtfulness or understanding because of the societal context of what the ramifications would be. And yes, I truly believe that, but also you've experienced the emotions now knowing that, various people experienced such harm. And so it was this real challenge to appreciate how important this was, the real and meaningful effects, and also not judge these human beings as only as valuable as the least valuable mistake they ever made.
I think that's such a great point, and I think it really rings in the book. You talk a lot about kind of Pat Fryman and the circumstances view of behavior throughout. Was that something that, as you were sort of prepping, okay, what's our outline? What do we want to be in this book? You talked about wanting to have that sort of what are the daily changes. Was that something that you already had in mind as, if we're talking about circumstances, then it's going to be a slam dunk to talk about daily behavior rather than who's evil and who's good? Or was that something that you sort of came to as you were sort of discussing or kind of swirling around that central idea of active ethical behavior?
Yeah, so the circumstances view and Pat Fryman's articulation of that was definitely in the mix from the very beginning. One thing that Linda added to that perspective that I found really valuable, and I hope readers will find valuable in the book, is some of Jonathan Haidt's work around basically the things that pull us away from that circumstances view, those initial reactions that may tend toward attack, may tend toward avoidance. To me, the combination of Fryman's circumstances view, our behavior analytic worldview, and some of Jonathan Haidt's works just really gets practical. Like, these are the kinds of emotional and contextual barriers that would make it harder to do the right thing. And so we can learn about them, and we can hopefully prepare ourselves to navigate them with those tools.
Yeah, I know one thing that came up again in the book. One thing, like so many things in the book, but one was a phrase that really jumped out at me, and is the idea of using the code as intended versus sort of using it as a weapon against others. And I know for myself, I've been studying the code and using the code and reflecting on the code for years and years and years. And even so, I feel like I'll go to a talk. I remember one that Rick Graff once did, talking about ethics and mentioning the idea of, where do you put your data sheets? Like, are they in a filing cabinet? Are they locked? And just even thinking of small behaviors as unethical or ethical. And I feel that sometimes I spend a lot of my effort trying to not be unethical and sort of like it's in the book, having that strong emotional reaction of this is unethical and I'm gonna stand up and show everyone. Like, I'm not trying to do theater of ethics, but it does sometimes feel as if I tell everyone how unethical they are, somehow that will make it easier for me to practice ethical behavior, which I don't believe is necessarily true, but boy, does it feel that way. What would you say is kind of the way that one could on a daily basis be thinking of themselves as practicing ethics or not, rather than sort of like, I wrote 10 violations today, therefore I must be ethical, as opposed to like a narc or kind of a jerk that no one wants to be around?
Robert, you're the ethics meter maid.
Yeah.
Here's your violation. For me, it's important to recognize that we're all human beings. That means the people who are out there making mistakes, even egregious ones, they are human beings. But we're also human beings. And human beings do tend to love them a self-righteous reinforcer. It's so good to be good. And it's even better to be better. And it's best to be the best. And one of the best ways to be any of those things is in contrast to the not good, worst. And so we're all susceptible to those things, and we don't have to be able to describe that susceptibility in order for our behavior to be influenced by it. And so, for me, that's where the problem-solving model that we talk about in the book comes in. As soon as you start thinking, wait a minute, that's not right. What's going on? What did they do? You got to pause. You got to take some breaths, and you've got to don't respond yet. Step one, what am I responding to? Why might this be upsetting me? Bring it back to the values. What do I actually know? And let me gather some information. And we use an analogy in there borrowed from Jonathan Haidt about the fact that, when a dog first encounters a new person, other dog situation, they are going to be vigilant first and tense and, what's going on. And then it takes a little while before the tail to start wagging, right? And so when we first encounter a situation that doesn't feel right, like we are going to experience those emotional responses. One might keep one's mouth shut just for a minute or two to let those dissipate, and just like, it's okay to describe that you're experiencing that, but that you can give yourself a minute or two to assure yourself you don't know everything. You don't know this person's circumstances. Let's get curious. It may well be a problem. You may need to do something about it, but jumping for someone's throat is never going to be the appropriate professional response. And remembering that whoever that person is, they are still a human being. Like, we have to actively prompt ourselves to do that, because in the moment, you just want to,
it's very true. And I'm not sure why sometimes it does feel like ethics and being able to get angry at people for mistakes. I think you lay it out really nicely in the book about like where's kind of the negative reinforcement of our behavior coming from, where are the rewards, how much of it is environmental or learned history, and a lot of factors I don't usually think of with ethics, because again, it used to be, I used to think of it as like, I have to follow these rules. Am I following these rules? Yes or no? Which is slightly better than when I first started doing ethics, probably in college, and it was like, well, I'm a good person, therefore ethics. I did it,
I don't think you're alone in that, Rob.
It was so much easier to do ethics back then. It was like, I don't want to hurt anyone. I guess I'm ethical. Big shrug.
I think, another piece of that is coming to understand that by adhering to the code, you're not going to never find yourself in an ethically complex situation where you have to make a fairly nuanced decision based on multiple pieces of the code, which are sometimes, at odds with one another with respect to the particular situation that you're in. And there is a lot to take into consideration. So it's not like, oh, I follow the code and therefore I am good, quote unquote good, right? It's, I understand the code and therefore I can interpret it as it needs to be interpreted in this situation. And some pieces of that decision are going to potentially be challenging any way we end up making the call.
And that notion of evolving ethics means even if I'm endeavoring to live according to these values and handle tough situations as well as I can right now, and I'm following the code, it does not mean that a future will not judge me ill because I behaved according to my current context, when the future context is quite different. And I think that can feel scary, but our ethics do evolve, and hopefully we're learning more. We understand things in different ways. We think about things differently. And thus our ethics code evolves, and it will evolve again. And there will be things that people did in 2012, 2019, 2026 that people in 2040 think, what the heck were they thinking? Much like we might do now about the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, etc.
Yeah. I talk to my students about that too in terms of language. So like an old article might use outdated language. And I say, well, at that point in time, that was what was current, what was understood. Now we use this language today, but in 15 years, we're going to look back and say, oh my God, I can't believe that's what we used, right? It's ever evolving. We as a community are deciding what is okay for our community. And that's true both of language and also of our ethics.
Absolutely.
So when we, as kind of practitioners, are thinking about our day-to-day ethics and thinking about the codes, one thing that kind of jumped out at me in your book that I'm sure I must have thought of it at some point, but it just really felt so clear is how much our ethics codes, and maybe it's because the focus was on the core principles rather than like individual, isolated code numbers, but just how many codes are really intertwined with others. And not just this is similar, but this one has to do with our consumers and stakeholders, and this one has to do with our supervisees, even though it's a similar principle. Are there codes that when you were sort of thinking about the active process and sort of getting, pen to paper or fingers to computer keyboard, that you realized, oh my goodness, these codes are so intertwined that if you start down the path of failing to follow this code, it's a domino effect. You're going to find yourself breaking this code and then this code and this code. Like, were there any that just felt like this is the keystone code? Don't mess this one up, or it's curtains for you?
I don't know if I can point to a single keystone code, but I will point to standards in multiple sections of the code related to timeliness and accuracy of communication or documentation. It's so boring to think about in detail, like how we go about documenting the work we do and communicating with others, whether it's supervisees or client families or administrators. But if you are not doing that well, it makes almost everything else foreseeable very challenging. And if you get caught in an unforeseeable situation, lapses in those areas become impossible to go back and renegotiate. So I'm going to advocate for the quote unquote boring stuff as the keystone. Anything related to timeliness of documentation, communication, and like retention of those records over the course of whatever legal requirements and certainly whatever services you're actively providing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As we went through particularly the chapters on the code, we talked about, do we just do them numerically, right? Here's item number 1, we're going to do that one, then number 2, then number 3. And as we started like laying them out in terms of what are the most jump out at you underlying values and what are the risks and benefits, what we started noticing is that there were these clusters of codes that had very similar risks and benefits. And so we started thinking, well, maybe we should, at least for some of the sections of the code, cluster those together so that people will understand that, if I mess up one of these, I'm likely to mess up a couple, 3, 4 of them. And likely for the same reasons. And so we then made the call to organize some of those chapters non-numerically and just hoped that we wouldn't get roasted because of it. Like, they can't even count. Look at that. But really we could. But so that notion that there are ones that cluster together and also ones across chapters, right? So ones from section 1 and 2 that show up again in 4. This was potent enough for us that in part 3, we really started thinking through not so much what are the keystone codes, but what are the keystone behaviors that if, you are doing this, you're likely to be in better shape than if you're not. And if you're not doing it, you will likely violate at least one of the codes, perhaps many. And you don't have to be a bad person to fall into this trap. So for me, I really wanted this to be about dispelling but I'm a good person, so I must be ethical. Most of the people who have substantiated ethical violations, they're perfectly good people who did not take care of the details or did not appropriately reflect on their behavior and their relationships, whether those relationships should be a certain way versus not, and the impact that they were having on other people. Or they just did not use technology in responsible ways, or didn't appreciate the boring stuff like documentation, care with respect to drawing from the literature. So that, I think, there are those keystone behaviors, and that's what some of the chapters in section 3 are about. So it is hopefully, rather than a don't be late, more a cultivate your skills in this area so that you are going to be, just thinking of it as like going to the gym, right? You're going to be strong and fit and ready to handle what comes at you in a way that won't make you vulnerable to the most kind of common ethical violation that a perfectly good, kind person might engage in. I figure like the true I'm out to hurt people for my own gains and money, that person's probably not reading this ethics book. So that's not who I needed to talk to, and eventually they'll get theirs. It's people who, the thousands and tens of thousands of us now that are out there every day trying to do the best we can under complicated and challenging circumstances, but we might get too busy and we might not pay attention to the details and we might not fully engage in perspective taking about the impacts that we're having on people.
One thing I really loved about each of the chapters is those self-assessment questionnaires and the self-assessment at the end of each of the standards. And it's like, am I doing this? Maybe not. Like, do I need to know more? I think that's really nice. And I think it's nice for students too, right? Because they can do a self-assessment on what they've learned. But I think it's also nice for more experienced BCBAs to remember that these are the things we're supposed to be doing. We might have forgotten them, sadly. Not for, like you said, not out of bad will, but just out of busy days.
Absolutely. It's not a destination. It's sort of, are you headed in the direction of fulfilling the letter and spirit of the code, or are you drifting in one or more areas? And I think that the norm is to have some amount of drift that many of us, probably the majority of us, experience that under certain circumstances, but being aware of it. And as Linda mentioned, that social awareness of what the impact of drift in those areas could be on the people around you. If you give yourself the opportunity to notice that, it's a really good first step toward kind of recalibrating and hopefully preventing a bad situation.
How many of those activities, because it is you wanted it to be a proactive book, and it is very much created to have self-reflection or checklists. How many of those activities were ones that you had to update for the book versus ones that you're like, this is one I've been using forever, or a mentor had suggested this and I've used it and I've trained people in my organizations to use it? I mean, was it sort of a mix? Were some you're like, this needs a self-reflection and let's see what's in the literature and let's see what some other professionals have, or were they all sort of ones that you've been using in your various roles for a while?
I think it's definitely a mixture, and I'll definitely get Linda's perspective on this too. But some of the activities come from my teaching of ethics over the years. Some of them were more specific to the book and developed for the book because we had those kinds of pillars of really wanting to have a proactive focus, really wanting to focus on positive ethics, not just the gotcha moments and the things not to do, but the 1,000 tiny ways that people are building more ethical environments in their day-to-day. So it depended, but it's definitely a mixture of both.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I had, as I mentioned, just finished a book on supervision and mentoring, and we created a lot of different kinds of tools and checklists and activities for that. And so I guess like that repertoire was a little bit at strength. But often what happened was we would be having a discussion about a chapter or about a topic and just talking. And then it's like, well, wouldn't it be great if, or like, I really wish that I had. And then it's like, oh, well, wait a minute. If we wish we had it, couldn't we just try to make it and then see how that goes? And so part of it was just kind of noticing when we were describing something or a way of thinking about something that could be useful, and then prompting ourselves, okay, well, let's at least try to turn that into an activity. And it might morph quite a bit, but we maybe got a nugget of something that could be one of those practical, everyday, put it in your environment so that it evokes the right behavior kind of tools.
Mm-hmm. Were there any of those that, thinking about it now, you're like, I'm so glad I wrote that because I've been using it every day, this self-reflection or this checklist, every time I've hit a situation, any that kind of jump out?
I will just say the activities related to positive ethics and noticing positive ethics around you have been pretty transformative for me and for my students. So I helped to write the book that I needed to read because there just really are 1,000 ways that the people I encounter in my professional circles are busting their butts, doing a great job. And it's in their job description. So we don't slow down to notice it or maybe thank people for it, but it's such a mutually beneficial thing to put time into that, noticing, and then also, if it's appropriate, expressing some gratitude for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say probably some of the self-reflection and self-assessment activities that are in one of the later chapters. I don't know that I specifically use those activities, but writing all of those activities really, I think, brought to mind for me how much we need to be protecting time for self-reflection as a regular activity, that it really is a repertoire. And many of us are not very good at it at all. And because of what the repertoire is, we won't have a clue that we're not very good at it. It means we have no perspective on the fact that we have no perspective. Yeah, right. Meta cluelessness. And so it can only help to have that regular reflection time. I have always been kind of a go fast, do a lot kind of person. And so, as Amanda said, kind of writing the book that I would love to have had 25 years ago and 20 years ago and 15 years ago. And, probably by 5 to 10 years ago, I started to get my groove on that. But let's hope that not every behavior analyst is going to take 20 to 25 years to build up to that.
That sounds fair. That's it. It's why we have folks like you both, who write books like this to help the next generation do it a little bit faster.
Yes.
And there are a lot of different ways in this book for people to access the material, I thought, too. So there's different types of tables and lists and checklists and self-assessments and scenarios, as well as personal anecdotes and so many cited resources that we already mentioned. So like whichever pathway is the best for you as a learner, there are access points, I feel like, in this book, which is really nice.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up those scenarios, Diana, because I almost felt like I was going to find myself in one. They were so real life. Like
they were hard. I found them very hard to read, not because they were difficult, but just reading them, they did feel like, ooh, that could be me. Like, oh, they were a little intense.
In it. Yeah, there was a scenario that said Jacqueline in it, and I was like, was that me a long time ago? It wasn't, though.
No.
Then I didn't laugh on. But I was like, uh-oh.
I think we experienced the scenarios that way as well when we were writing them. So we did try to write scenarios that related back to circumstances that we have been in or heard about, have some history around. But then when we'd actually craft the scenario, especially the ones that include a clear violation, I don't think there was a single one where Linda and I immediately thought, well, we know what this analysis is going to lead to. We really were constructing, the 5 steps of the problem-solving process as we went. And the goal there is for folks to see the resources and the potential utility of our foundational principles, like how much good guidance really is in the code. But yeah, we hope that will help promote some generality of responding if folks can take the time to thoughtfully go through. But we were scared too, Jackie. It was a lot.
Yeah, and often I think I would say, "Ooh, I resemble that remark," like there, but for one or two decisions, that might have been me. And to be honest with you, I kind of want people to have that reaction. I don't want them to think about ethics as what other people's behavior is or isn't. You have access to a whole lot more of your own behavior than anyone else will ever have access to. So if we can kind of get comfortable with the fact that, my circumstances and my learning history could lead me to not quite nail it, and an evolving pattern of not quite nailing it could actually end up with someone is harmed by my actions, that would actually be the better impact than if we make people more vigilant about looking at other people's behavior. That notion of like, mirror first, please. It's hard. It's uncomfortable.
I also did appreciate, though, that when you gave the scenarios, you also gave kind of an answer, not like a full answer, but you gave us some thoughts. Because when I read scenarios and there's nothing else, I'm like, am I wrong? Like, am I wrong in thinking what I'm thinking? Because I just read the chapter. I don't know everything. Am I wrong? So I actually really appreciated that. Like, I don't want to call it like a fact check, but it kind of felt like that for me when I like thought about it and then like read through the steps. That I thought that was really helpful.
It was a good model because, one could go through the steps and come up with totally different solutions.
And however, that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. But it was nice to see it in action over and over with some really uncomfortable situations.
Yeah, hopefully it landed as not so much what to think or what to do, although there are seeds of that in there, but like how to approach it, how to work the principles and work the code and work your, trusted colleagues, your resources to find a way forward that leads to some of those big reinforcers like integrity or having a compassionate or respectful effect on the people who are in the situation with you.
Somewhere in the book, we write that Amanda and I hope through this textbook, we've kind of become some of the first members of the ethics community of practice for the reader. But I think we're all better off if we don't think so much about ethics experts and we think about each other as ethics resources. Let me think through this and talk with a trusted colleague that I think generally makes reasonable decisions, see where we think similarly, where we think differently, talk through it. We could end up agreeing and both being wrong. That's, reliability but not validity. Yes, that could absolutely happen. But we're both likely to learn from and become a little less rigid and perhaps impulsive about our analysis if we do that. So hopefully reading through those scenarios, if you got to the end and thought like, okay, well, I kind of thought this way and I mostly agree with them. And I think that's pretty good. And I have a good rationale for why I do a different thing in step 3, then that is good, right? Then it means you felt like you had the right speaker and listener context.
Mm-hmm. One thing that comes up when we're talking about the context of ethics is the power of the environment. And you speak a lot about this in, I think it was in section 3 or the kind of the back half of the book, the idea of ethical environments and working for ethical organizations and some pitfalls that young BCBAs or new BCBAs, I should say, can have when they're looking at where's the best place for me to work. And I know something that came up, and I think it was chapter 7, one of the scenarios where it was Salida who engaged in insurance fraud is, how to create an environment and how to be in a company where the environment is such of we understand the context of your insurance fraud, and let's go through the problem-solving process, as opposed to that, I don't even know if it's an emotional response, but that, listen, you committed insurance fraud. Our company's in big, big trouble. You're fired. There's no problem-solving going on. And that fear, I think, that a lot of us have of, well, I don't want to do the ethics where I get fired, therefore I might as well lie as long as possible and hope no one notices it. You've both been in positions where you had to create those environments. I mean, what are the things that you feel as folks who have, power in those dynamics, having, worked in the big organizations, been professors, to create an environment where someone might say, listen, I am feeling stuck and I think I'm going to commit insurance fraud. What should I do? Rather than, ooh, I'm going to get in trouble. I better just do something illegal and unethical. Like what are the steps you can do to create that environment? Because I don't know if every business cares to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I lived in those shoes for years and years. And for me, the contingencies that will naturally support certainly lying, but also just kind of thinking away a little bit, not really thinking, noticing, speaking up. They're everywhere. They are absolutely everywhere. And part of what happens is if you are thinking about it and you're not sure that's exactly ethical, like there can be this kind of, are people going to think I'm a jerk if I bring this up? Or what if I'm wrong? And then and I don't have lots of savvy about how to bring it up in a tentative way, are people then going to think I'm a jerk that's trying to get them fired? And to be honest with you, a lot of time, we all have histories where we go to a supervisor or someone in the organization and we mention a problem and we get the look of like, is this what Wednesday is bringing me? And it creates a suppressive effect. And it can be so suppressive that we not only don't talk about it, but we don't think about it and we don't notice the details. So you have to work super, super hard to create reinforcement contingencies for people to notice, to mention, and that to know that if you bring up a problem, you don't have to be certain that it is a problem or an emergency, right? That creating a supervisory context where people will try to figure it out with you. That it's okay to say, is that smoke I smell? Like that doesn't mean we're all running out of the house with the family jewels, but we are definitely going to look into it and it probably won't be, and that will be okay. And that means you're paying attention to good things. And so it's about getting people responding as early in the process as possible, and also knowing what their likely learning histories are, even outside of that employment context of, if you mention it, you're the bearer of bad news, you're maybe not, being a friend to someone. So that's something that can happen too. Well, but I know that person. Right? Like, well, even whether you know that person or not, insurance fraud is insurance fraud, and you don't get a pass because I know you.
Yeah, that really lines up well with my thoughts around the importance of transparency. So for leaders to be able to transparently talk about when they are unsure or when they notice there's a thing they don't really want to talk about and be able to get curious about why that might be. Transparency around contingencies, to have a plan in advance. If you have a question about this, or if you get into a bad situation like this, here's what you could do. And here's what's going to happen as a result, to demystify a little bit the first next piece. And to Linda's point about understanding people's background to the extent that that is possible in our working relationships, there's a huge cultural dimension to our willingness, right, to ask tough questions to authorities, or the manner in which we express concerns. Maybe the level of emotional expression doesn't match the urgency or seriousness of the claim, and that's disorienting for some folks in the environment. But to be able to ask follow-up questions, learn more, be transparent about concerns or gaps in our perspective on the situation, I think all can really help to just ensure that we get to practice positive ethics and work through the tough stuff together.
That's exactly right. And you hear a word like insurance fraud and all of the autonomic nervous systems go, That said, there are errors in billing and claims. That's why there are review processes, et cetera. And so when you find something in self-report, this was billed this way, but it was billed with the wrong code. It was billed at the wrong date. The thing had not occurred. Here's, what we need to do. Here's the money back. That's over one, event that was billed incorrectly. That's not where you go to the federal penitentiary, right? That is about honesty, transparency. Oops, we will give that money back. And then, you're probably going to be monitored for a while, and you probably should be. And that notion of not being and helping people, even though it's something that they've never heard of before or thought about before, that you don't have to jump to the worst possible conclusion of what the outcome will be.
Do you worry, looking at kind of the field in general, like how many companies that provide human services that are hiring behavior analysts, there seems to be a lot more consolidation, national companies buying up smaller groups. Do you worry that projects like the Ethics Network that, that Linda, you were a guiding force in at Trumpet, which sets up environments that allows for so much ethical behavior to be front and center. Do you worry that that's going to get more and more lost and just set up contingencies where more behavior analysts feel stuck, like they can't behave ethically? Or is that just something that, sounds scary, but hopefully that's not, that doesn't seem to be the trend?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly possible. The opposite might also be possible. So rather than it necessarily being, is it a large organization or a small organization? It was on my mind more because I was at a large organization, and there were times when I thought to myself, there are 800, 1,000, 1,200, and the number kept going up. People out there behaving today in the name of Trumpet Behavioral Health. What are the chances that one of them's making a mistake? It's a given. What are and so that was so potent for me that I really felt the impetus to build infrastructure to try to minimize that. That said, there could have been a same size organization with a different leader that would not think of it the same way or not identify the right solution. And so part of it too is the leaders of the organization. How much do they lean towards or away from what might be those coercive contingencies that Sigmund tells us are everywhere around us unless we are actively kind of trying to lean away from them. And then there still will be some because life, right? So what I have seen frequently is, I do care about it. And so there are going to be really strong consequences if you screw up, rather than the notion that if you've already screwed up, it's too late. Let me assume that the majority of people who make mistakes didn't wake up that morning thinking I'm going to be an unethical beast. They simply behaved without the right circumstances, and let's create those. So I don't know. I think it is less about, is it a big organization or a small one? Is it, not for profit, independently owned, funder backed or what have you, and more about how the leaders of that organization create the culture, and whether they're willing to invest time and resources into proactivity. I will say that I have generally found that when an organization is acquired by a company that is already in healthcare, that company is already super sensitized to compliance, ethics hotlines, billing concerns. Like, they just have a background and sensitivity to the kinds of mistakes that will often cause significant problems in a way that many of us that really had our background in state-funded disability services or education services or university research-based programs, like, we don't know anything about billing software and, HIPAA compliance. Like, we do, but, there is the opportunity that these new partners have a knowledge base and care about things that can be a nice supplement to our concerns about the ethics code. It's just that you have to have clinical and operational and organizational leaders that are constantly talking to each other and valuing what each other says and taking care of what the other people care about and need, so that the organization can be robust and ethical and a great place to work and focused on positivity.
So is there a will? And if there is, you'll probably find that your company is going to look for a way to some extent.
That's right. And if the will's not strong, there's always consequences.
I know we're getting closer to the end of our time, but I did want to speak a little bit about the advent of technology, both social media and kind of future technologies that are sort of in the news a lot, AI and generative products and how that fits into ethics. What would you say are maybe some ways that either those advances fit perfectly into the kind of active ethical steps and problem-solving models that you lay out in the book? Or were there areas that you felt like these things are so unknown, I don't even know how they're going to fit into our model? Like where did some of those kind of future problems fall?
That's a great question. And, you're ending on some really huge issues here. But I think it's an empirical question. Not to piggyback too much off of Linda's previous response, but the ethics and guiding values that we bring to the advent of technology are going to determine, the kinds of effects that we can expect on the quality of care that's ultimately provided. And there will be an iterative process no matter what. We'll continue to learn because there will be unanticipated effects. But, I try to be like an optimistic realist. I think that technology promises a lot of potential resources to handle complexity, that we might be able to predict which combination of intervention components will probably work best for the student whose current learning patterns, over the last 3 months look like this, who's got these other contextual factors going on as far as comorbidity and things like that. So I feel optimistic about the potential of things like AI, but I also have to acknowledge that it's unknown territory, and we're just going to have to monitor closely and stay on top of the data and the information as it emerges, whether you consider yourself tech savvy or not at all interested in talking about AI, you have an ethical responsibility to read up and engage these topics and talk to the people in your community of practice because it's here. And now our job is to work within that context.
Mm.
I will say, too, one of my favorite lines in the book was, or I'm paraphrasing, but the behavioral principles are ethically neutral. It is our application of them that requires ethical consideration. And I feel like it's quite similar with AI, too, right? These tools are just that, tools, but we as a community have to decide how we want them to operate and what is going to be within the bounds of our general consensus is okay to use them. And that's just going to take time and conversation and guidelines that we as a human community have to develop.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Tell us how you really feel, Diana.
Yeah.
Jackie knows.
Well, I think one of the messages we try to get across in the book is that you've got to become good at using your resources, whether the resources are your community of practice, this 5-step problem-solving strategy, a technology-based tool to help you be better organized, AI, what have you. We'll generally be better off using our resources than not, but you also have to be appropriately skeptical and science-minded about those resources, right? So AI didn't go to grad school, but it could certainly gobble up some textbooks. If you give over your judgment and decision-making to AI, something's going to go wrong. So if you supplement what you already know and are thinking about and your good decision making with some facts and figures and information that AI can help you with, and then you kind of ask, where'd you get that from, AI? Is that a peer-reviewed journal, AI? That kind of thing. So it comes back to the same, I can't just, AI is going to do it. It'll be great. AI is great. Be skeptical, double check it, accept that responsibility. And a lot of times, my colleague Janet Twyman uses AI for all kinds of things. And it's just amazing what she has been able to produce. And she uses a variety of those tools, but she does it responsibly. And so it's new, which means we've got to figure out how to be responsible in use of the resource. I'm so freaking old that I remember when the electronic search engines really became much more powerful. Now we've got so many of them. Eric, Psychinfos, there are tons of them, but they are only as good as the user is. And I remember in grad school, people saying I've searched the literature. I know that's not out there. And it was out there, but it didn't have the right keyword. So that notion of I'm confident that I know all the things because I used a tool to help me find some things. We got to recognize we can all be prone to that and kind of challenge ourselves to be a little bit more skeptical and double check and get better at using the tools. And I think it will, in the long run, we will find ways to make it tremendously helpful.
Now, I know sort of social media and internet, like basic internet, that's not really new technology anymore in a lot of ways because, everyone uses it. But I did have a quick question. I hope, as two experts in the field, you can answer it. So we've got some friends every week. They put out let's call it an electronic radio show, about behavior analysis and ABA. They disseminate information about research. I hear it's great. I haven't listened, but, I worry, are there ethical pitfalls that even something like that, which seems so good and well-meaning for sharing information, that my friends who put out this electronic radio show might run into? I mean, certainly thinking about social media and these competing contingencies, that exist in this public space that didn't used to exist. Anything that you could share that we might be able to tell our friends they want to be keeping an eye on so they don't do anything unethically in that space?
Right.
Again, asking for a friend.
Oh, Rob and company, I think you need go no farther than look at your own example. I honestly want to compliment you guys. I'm going to flip the question a little bit. As long as I've been listening to the podcast, which we mentioned at the top is like a very long time, you all anchor your discussions in the peer-reviewed literature. You always have references for people to go read independently and check out, on their own. You all are very conscientious about bringing on guests who have within their scope of competence the topic at hand. And you all have really amazing, scopes of competence, which you reference, and you bring that in as context in so many of your conversations. I'm just going to keep picking on Rob here for a second, but the work that you do in schools is a contextual factor that sometimes really helps provide insight into the discussions. And sometimes I've heard you say, well, I'm not really in that world. So here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm asking. But I just think y'all are doing a great job. But yes, the world of public statements, the weighty responsibility that comes with deciding to disseminate information, which people will follow, which people will pick up and take as truth, which people will then pass on to their own students and supervisees. It's a huge responsibility. And I love that you were willing to ask this question on behalf of your friends.
Yeah, the fact that you're asking this question on behalf of your friends actually suggests that you're already doing one of the most important things, and that is behaving responsibly with the microphone. It is, very few people had the microphone when I was entering the field, and it darn sure wasn't me, and I was happy about that because I did not view myself as the one who knew the stuff anyway. When you actually do get the microphone, with it comes responsibility. And I think that for generations that have kind of grown up where everybody's got a microphone, everybody's got that same equal platform, that may not always be as fully present as a responsibility. And so I think just recognizing and honoring that responsibility of I might say something and say it very confidently and be wrong, and someone hears it and now takes it as fact and now behaves, etc. So accepting the responsibility and then speaking tentatively when appropriate, right? I know what I know, but I'm certain that I don't know everything I don't know. And that whoever you are out there listening, this idea is going to encounter a practical reality that's more nuanced than you heard about on this show. So those, I think, are two important parts of it. And the third, I would say, is this: challenge yourself with your own motivations. And I do think that when ethics and social media clash, that is often when we see some of the most aggressive, judging, bad, attacking, and I'm going to recruit all of my people to be in opposition to you or your people. Part of it is that in those circumstances, it's your fingers tapping on letters as opposed to a human being's face, visible and present to you, responding to your venom or vitriol. And that distance can really eliminate some of what would naturally rein in our more emotional responses and help us be our better selves, I hope. So to me, that always means before I post something on social media or immediately after and then quick try to fix it, really think through, why would I put this out there for 1,000 strangers that I don't even know to see? And if there is any emotionality anchored in it, give myself a minute and rethink. And maybe I'll still do it if I get past the emotionality and then think there's value to presenting this example in a calm way, then still do it. So those are the big three for me.
Oh, excellent. Well, I think with that, we can't cover the entire book because it's not an overwhelming read, but it is a long, nice book with a lot of good content. So let's move into Dissemination Station for some concluding thoughts. Oh, we're here. How nice. Well, I know quickly, and we'll kind of be sharing our own thoughts. We'll do that a little later. But I know for me, I found the book really great. It was a change in pace of what I'm expecting from ethics books. And while I think we talked about some of the scenarios being a little scary in how real they are, the focus on active problem solving behaviors that we could engage in as individuals, as part of larger groups, to behave ethically on a regular basis was such an exciting way to think about ethics. It was so much more active than I think a lot of times when I read ethics books and I'm just, what do I not want to do? How do I avoid getting in trouble? There were so many great tips of here's where you could get started. So for folks who are scared of I can't be ethical, I am super evil, and I did wake up trying to commit insurance fraud, you suggest some really easy, low response effort tasks. Even just printing out the problem solving. I think that you put in there, just print out the problem solving sheet and put in your schedule. I'm going to look at this sheet I printed out and put on my wall. Like anyone could do that one, right? That's not that hard. So no matter where you are, there's something to start with. I think I'm going to look at the stress and wellness section. Near the end, you start looking at self-management, and you have a lot of good self-management checklists. I know that's sort of where I kind of wanted to start some of my own, which again doesn't sound like it's not ethical, right? It doesn't sound like that's ethical behavior. But I think, Amanda, like you were saying, so much of our ethical conundrums stem from I wasn't thinking about my own well-being. I wasn't thinking about my time management. I was letting things get ahead of me, and now I am in the insurance fraud section.
Yeah, and I would venture to say, even thinking of the emerging ethical scenarios I've been aware of in my own experience and the experiences of those around me, so let alone actual violations, that those personal circumstances and wellness and time were factors in the majority. I feel comfortable saying that as an anecdote that I couldn't agree with you more, Rob. It's worth the investment.
You do something, and you mentioned crucial conversations a number of times in the book, and so I'm not sure if you were thinking of that when because they have a great summary of if you only remembered like two things from this book, here's the thing you have to remember, which I have therefore remembered. But you end the book or near the end of the book, 50 take-home points. I love 50 take-home points. It's a good, thorough book. We're not going to go through them all now, so I have to challenge you. Top three or top. You can do more if you want. Everyone always asks when I ask, give me one or two. Can I do five? You can do as many as you like. But if you had to pick like a top three take-home points from your book that you want to make sure listeners are having the forefront, whether they've read it and they just need to review it, or whether they're thinking about picking it up, or they have it on order, it's coming in the mail. Top three kind of take-home points that you want to make sure are clear as a bell from your book.
Right. Maybe we'll take turns. I'll do one, then Amanda can do one. One, we've talked so much about the behavioral worldview. That's absolutely one of my favorites, but we'll just leave it as, we've hit that. That's a take home. It's that speed of responses, right? That your conditioned emotional responses have super short latency. And it takes a little while for the tail or the rule-governed behavior and the clear thinking to catch up. And so just being aware of that and being able to tolerate and manage those emotional responses without engaging in behavior that's going to make a situation worse. That's a big take-home point for me.
Yeah, and for me, I wanted to highlight our take-home. It's number 18 in the massive list, for which there was a collective sigh of relief that we would not be working our way through line by line. But number 18 is all about our responsibility as professional behavior analysts to continuously grow in cultural and social awareness. One of the coolest things about the 2022 code is the elaborated, deepened language around cultural responsiveness. So anti-discrimination, anti-exploitation is still in there, but we're proactive now. And so right on par with our efforts to stay current with evidence-based practices, we need to be proactively engaged in developing our cultural humility and just continuing to grow those repertoires.
Yeah. And another one that I would point out is number 41, that science-mindedness is arguably the fifth core value, that we should not approach ethics differently than we do any other part of human behavior. We still have to be behavior analysts. And when we're talking about ethics, it means we have to be a behavior analyst about our own behavior, which means examining our controlling variables, our MOs, and setting up our environments to produce success and not assuming that success is a given, and ask the question, make it an empirical one.
Very good. And again, folks, there's 47 more take-home points in the book, so you're only getting a few for free right now. And then again, the final thing, and this is not necessarily related to ethics at all, but one thing that I love in a book is when there is a good last line. And I don't care if it's a handbook or a pamphlet or a book about ethics or a novel or a mystery, right? You have to have a good ending line. And I am always so impressed when folks can take this very complex situation, which we already talked about the thoroughness of the references and the action steps in there, that you still went to the trouble of having a really great last paragraph, especially your last sentence. And usually I just read the last sentence when we do these kind of book related episodes, but I would love it if one of you, or if you want to take turns, if you would at least read the last sentence of your book for our listeners. I think that would be a real treat for at least me. Whether anyone else cares, I don't know, but I would love it.
We will do this for an audience of one, even if that's the situation. But yeah, thanks for that, Rob. And here goes. I'm going to give just a couple of sentences worth to provide some context, but you, as a professional behavior analyst, your actions can write the foundational principles of integrity, respect, competence, and do no harm on every page of our next chapter as a field. The science of behavior and the code are your invitation to heed the words of Thoreau, be not simply good, be good for something. And we wish you every success in your next chapter.
That's so good. Did you plan to have a good last line, or did it sort of just naturally come up? Like you were like, I want to be done. End ethics. The end.
It was like
we were working. Yeah, exactly. We were working on this chapter chronologically toward the end of the process, and so I think we wanted it to feel. It felt to us like a moment, a milestone to slow down and really be present to, and so we wanted a paragraph that would reflect some of that.
Did you cry when you wrote it?
Shout out to our reviewers, and one of them said, I think it would be great if you had a really inspiring last message to the reader. And we had 7 different reviewers that offered us comments and perspective on different parts of the book.
They were amazing.
Really amazing. It made the book better. And they had prompted us to redouble our efforts. And then Amanda really, again, shout out to her. She was the one who said, I really want to focus on this idea. And she wrote the beautiful words.
Did you cry when you finished? Because that one feels like like you're like, It's like the end of like Felicity or Sex in the City or something.
Nailed
like,
it. You got it.
No, right? Because you're like, and then you're like, we wish you the best. Period. Right? You either cry or you're like high-fiving yourself.
I think the cry might still be coming, Jackie. I don't know. It's a slow build.
You write a book like this and you kind of put it out into the world, but you're not sure anyone reads it. And so now we've just had a conversation that clearly testament you read it because you brought up all of the things. And so maybe now I'll have to cry. Somebody read the fruits of our labor.
Oh, boy. Well, Dr. Linda LeBlanc, Dr. Amanda Karsten, thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing about the book and answering so many questions about it and going into it. If folks want to pick up the book, can you remind everyone the full title and where they can get a copy?
Yes, it is Ethics, Proactive and Practical Decision Making for Behavior Analysts. That is from Sloan Publishing, and there's an ebook available on Red Shelf, or you can also go to the Sloan website and get a paper copy that way.
And that's sloanpublishing.com.
Excellent. And Linda, I want to say I did just get a copy of the supervision book that you co-wrote with it was Dr. Sellers and Dr.
Sellers and Shala Lai. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have not read that one yet. I got through the ethics book. I had some other books I was doing, but I have it on my shelf. It's one of my summer reads, and I do appreciate how the ethics book binding and cover and formatting inside looks the same as the ethics book. So it almost feels like they're part of a series, like the Linda series of behavior analysis books. So if you write a third one, you have to buy it so you can kind of keep it looking really clean on the bookshelf. So just
that's right. Well, don't expect Harry Potter size series, but yes, it was an attempt to take many of the themes and attitude of that first book to bring it to the topic of ethics. And so hopefully you'll see some of those themes as consistent across the pair. But that the roads diverging in the wood was intentional, an extension of the nature theme. But that notion that you don't have to be aware that you just passed a fork in the road to make the decision. You're still going to end up somewhere. So not paying attention actually is a way of deciding. Maybe not the best way, but a way.
You never know. You may end up down the haunted path.
Exactly.
That's right. Well, we hope you enjoyed. We're back. It's me and Alan again, back wrapping up the show. We hope you enjoyed our full book club episode, including our thoughts at the front, as well as a chance where we spoke with the authors. And we want to say big thanks to Dr. Linda LeBlanc and Dr. Amanda Karsten for our discussion. And of course, thank you, Alan. We couldn't do a book club without you. So we're glad we were able to get you in and do this kind of mega amalgamation episode today.
Glad to be here, as always.
But don't worry, there's going to be even more Alan and us as the Summer of Book Club continues into next month, because this is just June. I think we've been doing these since April. That's the most books we've ever done. We're just reading machines over here. So we're going to wrap up the show. We want to thank you all so much for listening. You can please remember to rate and review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to the all of our previous episodes, as well as links to purchase this book that we discussed. And you can also purchase CEs. And speaking of that, you probably want your second secret code word. It is Aspen, ASPEN. Is it the mountain? No. Is it a type of tree? I don't even know what it is. Is aspen a tree? Maybe.
Yeah.
Am I okay, Al's nodding, yes. No, but that's not what it is. It is Dr. LeBlanc's dog, Aspen. What? It's another dog name. Not a new dog, but a dog, a very nice dog. We got to hear some dog stories off mic. Anywho, Aspen, ASPEN. Oh, hey. If you're thinking you like these book clubs and you said, you know what I love even more? I'd love to get every single book club ever that's ever been done. I'd like to vote on some of the books that are done. Well, then you need to go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and subscribe there. Subscribers at the $10 and up level get access to our quarterly listener choice episodes where listeners get to vote on our episodes, as well as all of our book clubs. Some of them are coming out for everyone on our main feed this summer, because again, summer book club, but some are not. And even if you're not, whether you're getting them now or getting them in the past, listening to old ones, being a patron gets you those CEs for no additional cost, just as a thank you for subscribing to the show. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Some final thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro outro music, Carl Sturry for interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. He's got to travel through time to edit this episode together, folks. So thanks so much to Dan. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, and be back next month with another book club episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye!